I was lying in the hospital recovery room, still groggy from anesthesia, when I noticed my husband Michael frantically typing on his phone with a smile I hadn't seen in months. 3 days later, when I tried to buy groceries, my card was declined. Our joint account, which had contained nearly $200,000 the morning of my surgery, was completely empty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Michael didn't know was that during our 7-year marriage, I had quietly built a portfolio of offshore investments worth over $3 million, assets he had no idea existed, accounts he couldn't touch, and a financial foundation that would soon become his worst nightmare. The antiseptic smell of Cedar Valley Medical Center had become as familiar to me as my own perfume over the past 6 months. What started as occasional fatigue and irregular periods had evolved into a medical mystery that stumped 3 different specialists before Dr. Chen finally identified the fibroid tumors that had been quietly growing in my uterus. The surgery to remove them was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, a date that now feels like a dividing line between the woman I was and the woman I was about to become. I remember the morning with crystalline clarity, not because of the medical procedure ahead, but because of the small moments that would later seem so significant. Michael made me coffee in my favorite mug, the ceramic one my sister brought back from her honeymoon in Italy. He kissed my forehead and told me everything would be fine, that he would be right there when I woke up. His voice carried that gentle reassurance I had fallen in love with 9 years earlier when we met at a financial conference in Chicago. Back then, I was Sarah Mitchell, a rising star in international investment banking with Goldman Sachs. I specialized in emerging markets and had built a reputation for identifying opportunities in Southeast Asian currencies before they became obvious to everyone else. Michael was presenting on domestic real estate trends, confident and articulate, with an easy smile that made complex market analysis seem approachable. We spent 3 hours in the hotel bar after his presentation, debating investment strategies and discovering we shared the same contrarian approach to risk assessment. What attracted me most wasn't his conventional good looks or his MBA from Northwestern, though both were certainly appealing. It was his curiosity about my work, the way he asked thoughtful questions about international markets, and seemed genuinely impressed by my insights into currency fluctuations. Most men I met in finance either dismissed my expertise or felt threatened by it. Michael appeared to celebrate it. Our courtship unfolded across airports and conference calls, weekend trips to evaluate real estate opportunities, and long dinners, where we analyzed market trends with the passion other couples reserved for discussing movies or books. When he proposed 18 months later, it was during a business trip to Singapore, in the same hotel where I had just closed a particularly complex deal involving Malaysian government bonds. He said he wanted to be part of my success, not separate from it. The first 3 years of our marriage felt like a partnership between equals. We bought a house in Westfield, a charming colonial with enough space for the home office I needed, and the workshop where Michael restored vintage furniture as a hobby. I continued traveling for Goldman Sachs while he built his real estate development company, Mitchell Properties. We talked about our individual projects over dinner, celebrated each other's wins, and strategized about challenges. I should have noticed when that dynamic began to shift, but change in a marriage can be as gradual as erosion, barely perceptible until you realize how much ground has been lost. It started around our 4th anniversary, when Michael's company faced some cash flow issues during a particularly aggressive expansion phase. I offered to help with the financing, suggesting some international investment vehicles that could provide better returns than traditional bank loans. His response surprised me. He thanked me for the offer, but said he preferred to handle business challenges independently, that mixing our professional lives too closely might complicate our personal relationship. At the time, it seemed reasonable, even admirable. I respected his desire to maintain some autonomy, and honestly, I was juggling my own demanding travel schedule and complex deals. But gradually, Michael stopped asking about my work with the same genuine interest. When I returned from trips to Hong Kong or Dubai with stories about successful negotiations or interesting market developments, his attention seemed elsewhere. He would nod politely and change the subject to his latest renovation project or a property he was considering. It felt like my professional life was becoming background noise in our marriage. The shift accelerated when I made the decision to leave Goldman Sachs 3 years ago. Not because Michael asked me to, but because I wanted to try something different. I had been considering starting my own investment advisory firm, something smaller and more selective that would allow me to work with high-net-worth individuals while maintaining better work-life balance. Michael was supportive of the idea, enthusiastic even, talking about how we could finally spend more time together and maybe start thinking about children. What I didn't anticipate was how the transition would affect our dynamic. At Goldman Sachs, I had been Sarah Mitchell Patterson, managing director, with a corner office and a team of analysts. At home, I gradually became just Sarah Patterson, Michael's wife, the woman who used to work in finance but now had flexible time to manage household responsibilities and support his growing business. It wasn't intentional, this gradual diminishment of my professional identity. Michael never explicitly asked me to step back from my ambitions. But when his company faced challenges, I found myself providing informal consulting without formal recognition. When we attended industry events, I was introduced as his wife rather than as an independent financial professional. When we socialized with other couples, the conversation assumed I was taking a break from my career rather than building something new. I tried to launch my investment firm, Meridian Advisory, during our 5th year of marriage. I had identified a niche in helping tech entrepreneurs and executives manage sudden wealth from IPOs and acquisitions. The demand was there. The expertise was definitely there, but something always seemed to interfere with my focus. Michael's company needed help with financing. We were renovating the kitchen. His mother was having health issues and needed support. There was always something more immediate than my long-term professional goals. The most insidious part was how reasonable each interruption seemed in isolation. Of course, I would help my husband navigate a difficult business situation. Of course, family needs took priority over career ambitions. Of course, I could delay launching my firm for a few months while we dealt with more pressing concerns. But those few months stretched into years, and my business plan gathered dust while my expertise was quietly absorbed into supporting Michael's success. I should have recognized the pattern, should have insisted on boundaries that protected my professional development. But love, especially the comfortable kind that develops over years of shared domestic life, can make you complicit in your own erasure. I told myself I was being flexible, supportive, mature about prioritizing our marriage over individual ambitions. What I was actually doing was allowing my identity to be slowly consumed by his needs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wake-up call should have come 2 years ago when Michael's company landed its biggest contract ever, a mixed-use development project worth $47 million. The financing was complex, requiring a combination of traditional bank, loans, private investors, and creative structuring to make the numbers work. Michael struggled with the international components, particularly some currency hedging that could protect against exchange rate fluctuations. I spent 3 weeks analyzing the deal structure, identifying risks he hadn't considered, and developing strategies that ultimately saved Mitchell Properties nearly $2 million in potential losses. My recommendations were incorporated into the final proposal. My risk analysis became the foundation for their investor presentations, and my international banking connections provided access to more favorable terms than Michael could have secured, independently. When the contract was announced in the local business journal, Michael was featured prominently as the visionary developer who had secured the largest commercial deal in the county's history. My contribution wasn't mentioned, not in the article, not in his interviews, not even in the thank you speech he gave at the project launch party. I had become invisible infrastructure in his success, essential but unacknowledged. I should have confronted this pattern directly, should have demanded recognition for my contributions, and insisted on maintaining my own professional trajectory. Instead, I retreated further into the comfortable fiction that I was choosing to prioritize our marriage over my career. It was easier than acknowledging how thoroughly I had allowed my identity to be subsumed into his. The irony is that during this period of professional dormancy, I was actually building the most sophisticated investment portfolio of my career. While Michael assumed I was essentially retired from finance, I was quietly managing a growing collection of international investments that had started as a hobby and evolved into something much more substantial. It began innocently enough. During my Goldman Sachs years, I had developed relationships with private banks in Switzerland, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. When I left the firm, I maintained those connections, partly out of professional habit and partly because I enjoyed staying current with international markets. I started with small investments, $10,000 here, $20,000 there, exploring opportunities in emerging markets that most American investors never considered. The beauty of international investing, particularly through private banking, relationships, is the combination of diversification and discretion it provides. While American markets were experiencing volatility, Southeast Asian currencies were stabilizing after their recent corrections. While domestic real estate was reaching what I considered unsustainable valuations, European bonds were offering attractive yields with lower risk profiles. More importantly, these investments existed in a completely separate financial ecosystem from our domestic accounts. Michael knew I had some international banking relationships from my Goldman Sachs days, but he assumed those were dormant professional connections rather than active investment vehicles. When statements arrived by secure courier or through encrypted digital platforms, they went to my private email address and were stored in a safety deposit box I had maintained since my single days. The portfolio grew methodically over 3 years. A successful currency trade in Malaysian ringgit generated enough profit to explore opportunities in Vietnamese manufacturing stocks. A well-timed investment in Singapore real estate investment trusts provided steady returns that I reinvested in Swiss franc bonds. A particularly prescient bet on Indian technology companies during their pre-IPO phase generated returns that exceeded my most optimistic projections. By the time I was diagnosed with fibroids, my international portfolio had grown to just over $3 million, spread across 17 different investment vehicles in 8 countries. Michael had no idea it existed, not because I was deliberately hiding it from him, though I suppose that's technically what I was doing, but because he had long since stopped showing genuine interest in my financial activities. The complexity of managing these investments while maintaining the facade of being a financially dependent housewife required careful orchestration. I conducted research during Michael's business trips, made trades during his golf games, and monitored positions while he worked late at the office. The intellectual challenge was exhilarating after years of channeling my analytical skills into supporting his projects rather than pursuing my own. What started as intellectual curiosity had evolved into something more significant: financial independence that Michael couldn't touch, couldn't control, and couldn't leverage for his own purposes. Without consciously planning it, I had created a safety net that existed entirely outside our shared financial life. The medical issues that led to my surgery began manifesting about 8 months before the October operation. Irregular periods that I initially attributed to stress, fatigue that I blamed on poor sleep, and abdominal pressure that my primary care physician dismissed as normal aging. Women's health concerns are often minimized in medical settings, and I had internalized that dismissal, pushing through symptoms while maintaining my household responsibilities and continuing to provide unofficial consulting for Michael's business. When the symptoms became impossible to ignore, the diagnostic process was frustrating and prolonged. My first gynecologist suggested birth control to regulate my periods. When that failed to address the underlying issues, She referred me to a specialist who ordered an ultrasound that revealed the fibroid tumors. They weren't malignant, Dr. Chen assured me, but they were large enough to cause significant discomfort and would likely continue growing without intervention. The recommended treatment was a myomectomy, a surgical procedure to remove the fibroids while preserving the uterus. Dr. Chen explained that the surgery was relatively routine, but would require general anesthesia and a recovery period of 4 to 6 weeks. The timing was complicated because Michael's company was in the middle of negotiating a new development project, but we decided to schedule the surgery for October, when his workload would be slightly less demanding. Michael seemed appropriately concerned about the medical situation. He attended my consultation appointments, asked thoughtful questions about recovery expectations, and arranged his schedule to be available during my hospitalization. His attention to these details felt like a return to the partnership dynamics of our early marriage, the sense that we were facing challenges together rather than living parallel lives. The night before my surgery, Michael made dinner at home instead of working late at the office. We talked about practical arrangements for my recovery period, who would handle grocery shopping and household maintenance while I was restricted from lifting and strenuous activity. He seemed attentive and caring, reassuring me about the procedure and promising to be there when I woke up in recovery. I remember feeling grateful for his support as I prepared for bed that evening. After months of feeling like an afterthought in our marriage, his focused attention reminded me why I had fallen in love with him. Maybe my medical situation would provide an opportunity to reconnect, to rebuild the partnership that had gradually eroded over recent years. What I didn't know was that Michael had spent the previous 3 weeks researching our financial accounts with the thoroughness he typically reserved for real estate investments. While I was focused on medical preparations and recovery planning, he was apparently conducting his own form of due diligence, mapping our shared assets and identifying opportunities that my temporary incapacitation would provide. The morning of my surgery, Michael drove me to Cedar Valley Medical Center at 6:30 for my 8 o'clock procedure. The preoperative routine was efficient and professional. Nurses verified my identity, confirmed the surgical plan, and prepared the IV line for anesthesia. Dr. Chen stopped by to review the procedure one final time and answer any last-minute questions. Michael kissed me goodbye before I was wheeled into the operating room, squeezing my hand and promising to be right there. When I woke up, his smile was warm and reassuring, exactly what I needed to see before being sedated for surgery. As the anesthesia took effect, my last conscious thought was gratitude for having such a supportive husband during a challenging time. The surgery took approximately 3 hours, longer than expected because the fibroids were more extensive than the initial ultrasound had revealed. When I finally regained consciousness in the recovery room, I was disoriented and nauseous from the anesthesia. The nurse explained that everything had gone well, that Dr. Chen had successfully removed all the problematic tissue, and that I could expect a normal recovery process. Michael was indeed there when I woke up, sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed with his laptop open. I assumed he was handling business communications, staying connected to his projects while spending the day at the medical center. His presence felt reassuring, evidence that he was prioritizing my needs over his work demands. What I noticed, even through my post-anesthetic fog, was his unusual focus on his phone. Not just checking messages periodically, but sustained attention to the screen, typing intently, occasionally making quiet phone calls. When I asked if everything was okay with his business, he assured me that everything was fine, that he was just handling some routine communications. Over the next 2 days in the hospital, Michael's phone activity continued. He would sit beside my bed, holding my hand and asking about my comfort level, but his attention kept drifting to his device. When nurses came in for checks, or when I dozed off, I would wake to find him typing emails or engaged in hushed phone conversations in the hallway. I assumed his distraction was work-related stress. Michael's company was always juggling multiple projects and client demands. Being away from the office for extended periods, even for legitimate family emergencies, created complications that required constant communication and problem-solving. I felt guilty that my medical situation was adding pressure to his already demanding schedule. The discharge process on Thursday afternoon was straightforward. Dr. Chen reviewed my post-operative instructions, prescribed pain medication and antibiotics, and scheduled follow-up appointments for the next several weeks. Michael helped me get dressed and gathered my belongings while maintaining his cheerful, attentive demeanor. He seemed relieved to be taking me home, talking about how nice it would be to have me comfortable in our own bed. During the drive home, Michael's mood was notably upbeat. He talked about plans for my recovery period, suggested we order takeout from my favorite restaurant for dinner, and mentioned that he had cleared his schedule for the next few days to help with my immediate needs. His consideration felt genuine and touching, a reminder of the man I had married. What I didn't realize was that while I had been unconscious on an operating table, Michael had been executing a plan that had apparently been in development for weeks. A plan that would soon transform my medical vulnerability into the foundation for my ultimate empowerment, though neither of us could have predicted that outcome at the time. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days after my discharge. I was feeling stronger, more mobile, and decided to drive to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for soup. Michael had been handling most of the household tasks, but I was eager to regain some independence and contribute to my own recovery process. At the checkout counter, I handed the cashier my debit card for a modest grocery purchase, maybe $67 worth of ingredients and household items. The transaction was declined. Confused, I tried the card again, thinking perhaps I had entered my PIN incorrectly. Declined again. The cashier, a young woman with sympathetic eyes, suggested I try a different card. I pulled out my credit card, which was also declined. Standing there in the grocery store checkout line, holding items I couldn't purchase with cards that had always worked perfectly, I felt a cold realization beginning to form. I apologized to the cashier and the customers waiting behind me, abandoned my groceries, and drove home with shaking hands. Michael wasn't there. According to the note on the kitchen counter, he had gone to meet with potential investors for his latest project and wouldn't be back until evening. I immediately called our bank, First National, where we had maintained our primary checking and savings accounts throughout our marriage. After navigating the automated phone system and verifying my identity with security questions, I was connected to a customer service representative who delivered information that felt like physical blow. Our joint checking account, which had contained $47,000 the week before my surgery, had a current balance of $23. Our joint savings account, which had held an additional $156,000, was completely empty. In total, more than $200,000 had been transferred out of our shared accounts over the past 4 days. The customer service representative, professional but clearly uncomfortable, explained that all transactions had been conducted using proper authorization. Michael, as joint account holder, had legal access to transfer funds without my signature or consent. The transfers had gone to an account at a different bank, beyond First National's ability to track or reverse. I sat in our kitchen, still weak, from surgery, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. While I was unconscious and vulnerable, Michael had systematically emptied our shared financial accounts. Money we had accumulated together over 7 years of marriage, funds I had contributed from my Goldman Sachs salary and he had generated through his real estate business, had been transferred somewhere beyond my access or control. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I initially struggled to accept its reality. This was the man who had held my hand in the hospital, who had assured me everything would be fine, who had kissed my forehead and promised to take care of me. How could the same person have been simultaneously draining our accounts while I recovered from surgery? But as I sat there reviewing bank statements and transaction records, the evidence was undeniable. The transfers had begun on Tuesday, the day of my surgery, and continued through Thursday, the day I was discharged. Methodical withdrawals that avoided triggering automatic fraud alerts, each one authorized with Michael's legitimate access credentials. What Michael didn't know, what he couldn't have discovered through his apparent reconnaissance of our shared financial life, was that our joint accounts represented only a fraction of my actual financial resources. The international portfolio I had built over 3 years, the investments he had no knowledge of, the safety net I had created without conscious intention, remained completely untouched. As I sat in our kitchen that Friday afternoon, abandoned groceries forgotten and our joint accounts emptied, I realized that Michael's betrayal had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for my liberation. He had eliminated the financial ties that bound us together while leaving me with resources he couldn't access, couldn't control, and couldn't steal. For the first time in years, I felt the familiar stirring of strategic thinking that had made me successful at Goldman Sachs. Michael had made a critical error in his assessment of my financial position. He had underestimated my resources, miscalculated my capabilities, and provided me with perfect motivation to demonstrate exactly what he had lost when he chose betrayal over partnership. The woman he had left financially vulnerable in a grocery store checkout line was about to become his most formidable opponent. And unlike him, I had no intention of limiting myself to conventional rules of engagement. The silence in our house that evening was suffocating. Michael had texted around 4 o'clock saying his investor meeting was running late and he would grab dinner out, wouldn't be home until after 9. For the first time in our marriage, I was grateful for his absence. I needed time to think, to plan, to understand the full scope of what had happened while I was unconscious and helpless. I spent those hours methodically reviewing every financial document I could access from our home office. Bank statements, credit card records, investment portfolios, insurance policies, and mortgage documents spread across the dining room table like evidence in a criminal investigation. What emerged was a pattern of deception that went far deeper than the surgical week betrayal. Michael had been siphoning money from our joint accounts for months, maybe longer. Small transfers I had attributed to business expenses or routine money management were actually systematic withdrawals to accounts I knew nothing about. The $50,000 transfer in July that he said was for equipment financing. The $35,000 withdrawal in August, allegedly for a down payment on new office space. The recurring monthly transfers of $3,000 to $5,000 that appeared on statements as business loan payments. None of it was what he had claimed. I called the equipment financing company listed on his supposed loan documents. They had no record of any transaction with Mitchell Properties. The office space he claimed to have secured didn't exist at the address he had provided. The business loans he was supposedly servicing had been paid off 2 years earlier, according to the actual lender's records. Michael had been lying to me systematically for over a year, possibly longer. The man I had trusted with every aspect of our shared life had been treating our marriage like a shell company, extracting resources while maintaining the facade of partnership. My medical emergency hadn't created an opportunity for betrayal. It had simply accelerated a plan that was already well underway. The realization that I had been living with a stranger, someone capable of such calculated deception, was almost more devastating than the financial theft itself. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. This was sustained fraud against the person who had supported his business, shared his bed, and trusted him with her future. But as I sat surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, I felt something unexpected beginning to emerge alongside the hurt and anger. Clarity. For the first time in years, my mind felt sharp and focused in the way it had during my Goldman Sachs days when I was analyzing complex international deals and identifying opportunities that others missed. Michael had made several critical errors in his calculation. First, he had underestimated my financial sophistication. He assumed that because I had stepped back from active investment banking, I had lost the analytical skills that had made me successful. Second, he had miscalculated the scope of my resources. He knew about our joint accounts but had no idea about the international portfolio I had built independently. Third, and most importantly, he had provided me with perfect moral justification for any action I chose to take in response. I walked upstairs to our bedroom and retrieved the key to my safety deposit box at First National, the same bank where Michael had just emptied our accounts. The irony wasn't lost on me that I would be accessing my secret resources from the same institution he had used to betray me. The safety deposit box contained 3 years of statements from my international investments, documents that told a very different story about my financial position than the one Michael believed. Swiss bank accounts with Credit Suisse and UBS. Investment portfolios managed through private banks in Singapore and Hong Kong. Real estate investments in London and Dubai handled through Cayman Islands shell companies. Currency trading accounts that had generated substantial profits during recent market volatility. The total value was just over $3 million, money that existed entirely outside the American banking system and beyond Michael's ability to trace or access. More importantly, these weren't passive investments gathering dust. I had been actively managing this portfolio throughout our marriage, staying current with international markets and making strategic moves that had generated consistent returns. While Michael thought I was decoratively managing our household and occasionally offering amateur business advice, I had actually been operating as a sophisticated international investor. The skills that had made me valuable at Goldman Sachs hadn't atrophied during my domestic years. They had evolved and expanded into areas Michael couldn't even comprehend. I photographed every relevant document with my phone and uploaded them to an encrypted cloud storage account I maintained through a Swiss technology company. Then I returned the originals to the safety deposit box and drove home to wait for Michael's return. I needed to see his face when he walked through our door. Needed to observe how he would behave, knowing what he had done while maintaining the pretense of our marriage. He arrived home just after 9:30, whistling softly as he came through the garage door. His mood was notably upbeat, almost celebratory. He kissed my cheek and asked about my day, whether I was feeling stronger, if I needed anything for my continued recovery. His performance was flawless, the concerned husband attending to his convalescing wife. I told him about my experience at the grocery store, about the declined cards and the confusion at the checkout line. I watched his face carefully as I described the embarrassment and frustration of being unable to complete such a simple transaction. His expression showed exactly the right combination of surprise, concern, and determination to resolve the problem immediately. "That's strange," he said, frowning thoughtfully. "Let me call the bank in the morning and find out what's going on. There might be some kind of fraud alert or system error. These things happen sometimes after unusual account activity." The ease with which he delivered this lie, the apparent sincerity of his concern, was almost impressive in its shamelessness. "What kind of unusual activity?" I asked, maintaining my own performance as the confused and dependent wife. "Oh, business transfers, project financing, the normal stuff that sometimes triggers automated security measures. I moved some money around this week for the investor group, and sometimes that creates temporary holds on other transactions." He spoke with the casual confidence of someone who believed his deception was working perfectly. I nodded and accepted his explanation, playing the role he expected while mentally cataloging every detail of his performance. Michael clearly believed he had successfully executed his plan without detection. He had no idea that I had spent the evening uncovering the full scope of his betrayal, much less that I possessed resources he couldn't access or even imagine. Over the next several days, Michael maintained his caring husband facade while presumably completing whatever financial maneuvers he had initiated during my surgery. He brought me breakfast in bed, helped with household tasks I was supposedly too weak to handle, and expressed concern about my recovery progress. He also spent considerable time on his phone and laptop, often stepping outside for private conversations that he claimed were work-related. I used my recovery period to conduct my own investigation, calling contacts from my Goldman Sachs days, who now worked at various financial institutions throughout the city. Through careful questioning that seemed like casual professional catch-up, I learned that Michael had been actively shopping for divorce attorneys over the past 2 months. He had also made inquiries about liquidating real estate assets quickly and had asked about transferring business ownership to new corporate structures. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been planning to abandon our marriage for months, systematically extracting shared assets while positioning himself for a clean financial exit. My medical emergency hadn't created his opportunity. It had simply provided the perfect cover for accelerating his timeline. But Michael had made one crucial miscalculation in his planning. He had built his entire strategy around the assumption that I was financially dependent on him, that our shared accounts represented my only significant resources. He had never bothered to understand the depth of my financial sophistication or the scope of my independent capabilities. His plan required a victim who would be left helpless by his betrayal. Instead, he had provided perfect motivation to someone with resources he couldn't touch and skills he had never bothered to understand. By the following Monday, exactly 1 week after my surgery, I had developed a comprehensive understanding of Michael's deception and a preliminary strategy for my response. I had also made several phone calls to reactivate professional relationships that had been dormant during my domestic years. The first call was to Jennifer Walsh, my former colleague at Goldman Sachs, who now ran her own boutique investment firm in Manhattan. Jennifer had been trying to recruit me for years, knowing my expertise in international markets and my relationships with private banks throughout Asia and Europe. When I explained that I was interested in discussing immediate consulting opportunities, her enthusiasm was immediate and gratifying. "Sarah, I've been waiting for this call for 3 years," she said. "I have clients right now who need exactly your kind of expertise. High net worth individuals looking for alternative investment strategies, tech entrepreneurs who want to diversify beyond domestic markets, family offices that need someone who understands international currency hedging. When can you start?" The answer was immediately. Jennifer offered me a consulting arrangement that would provide both substantial compensation and complete flexibility to work from anywhere. More importantly, she offered to serve as a reference for similar arrangements with other firms, leveraging my reputation and relationships to create multiple income streams. The second call was to David Chen, a partner at Morrison, Klein & Associates, the most prominent divorce law firm in the state. David specialized in high-asset divorces involving complex financial structures, exactly the kind of case my situation was about to become. I scheduled a consultation for the following Thursday, giving myself time to organize documentation and prepare for legal proceedings. The third call was to Marcus Rivera, a private investigator I had met through my Goldman Sachs work when we needed to verify the backgrounds of international business partners. Marcus specialized in financial investigations, tracking hidden assets, and uncovering deceptive business practices. I retained his services to conduct a comprehensive investigation of Michael's recent financial activities and business dealings. The fourth call was to Amanda Foster, a public relations consultant who worked with high-profile individuals navigating personal crises that could affect their professional reputations. While I hoped to handle my divorce privately, I wanted professional guidance available if Michael chose to make our split public or if media attention became unavoidable. Each conversation was energizing in ways I hadn't experienced in years. These were people who understood my capabilities, who spoke the language of complex financial strategy, who treated me as a peer rather than as someone's wife. Talking with them reminded me of who I had been before I allowed my identity to be subsumed into Michael's life and ambitions. By Wednesday of that week, I felt strong enough to drive to downtown Denver for my first face-to-face meeting since my surgery. David Chen's law office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the city, the kind of prestigious address that signaled serious legal firepower. David himself was exactly what I had expected. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed, with the calm confidence that comes from handling the city's most complex and contentious divorces. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, gesturing to a chair in his elegant conference room. thank you for coming in. I understand you're dealing with some challenging circumstances. I had prepared for this meeting meticulously, organizing documents and rehearsing my presentation with the same care I had once brought to Goldman Sachs client pitches. David listened without interruption as I explained the timeline of Michael's deception, the scope of the financial theft, and the evidence I had gathered about his broader planning. When I finished, David was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the documentation I had provided. Finally, he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Patterson, in 25 years of practicing family law, I've seen every kind of marital deception imaginable. But the systematic nature of what your husband has done, particularly the timing around your medical emergency, is unusually calculated. He leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. The good news is that we have excellent documentation of his fraudulent activities. The transfers during your surgery, the false explanations about business expenses, the pattern of deception over many months. All of this creates a strong foundation for both civil and potentially criminal proceedings. Criminal proceedings? I asked, though I wasn't entirely surprised by the possibility. Theft by deception, fraudulent conversion of marital assets, potentially other charges depending on what else we discover about his business dealings. Your husband may have thought he was simply executing a clever divorce strategy, but what he's actually done is commit multiple felonies. David explained the process of forensic financial investigation that would be necessary to trace all of Michael's hidden assets and recover stolen funds. He also outlined the timeline for divorce proceedings and the various strategic options available for protecting my interests and ensuring appropriate consequences for Michael's actions. However, David continued, before we discuss strategy in detail, I need to understand your complete financial picture. What resources do you have available independently? What assets exist outside your shared accounts? The scope of your independent resources will significantly affect our approach. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the revelation that would transform me from victim to empowered adversary. I opened my portfolio and began explaining my international investment activities, the relationships with private banks, the offshore accounts, and the sophisticated currency and real estate investments I had built over 3 years. David's expression shifted from professional attention to genuine surprise as I detailed the scope and sophistication of my independent financial position. When I finished explaining that my international portfolio was worth over $3 million, all of it completely beyond Michael's reach or knowledge, David sat back in his chair with what might have been the first genuine smile I had seen from him. Mrs. Patterson, he said slowly, this changes everything. Your husband appears to have stolen approximately $200,000 from shared accounts while leaving you with access to resources 15 times larger than what he took. He's not just a thief, he's an incompetent thief. The legal strategy David outlined was both comprehensive and devastating for Michael. First, we would file for divorce with a detailed accounting of his fraudulent activities, seeking full recovery of stolen funds plus damages and penalties. Second, we would initiate civil proceedings for fraudulent conversion and breach of fiduciary duty, targeting not just the stolen money, but his business assets and future earnings. Third, we would coordinate with District Attorney's Office to pursue criminal charges that could result in significant jail time. But the most elegant aspect of David's strategy was how it would leverage my international resources to create maximum pressure on Michael while protecting my own assets from any potential retaliation. My offshore accounts and foreign investments existed in jurisdictions where American divorce courts had limited reach, meaning they would remain completely secure, regardless of how contentious proceedings became. Your husband planned to leave you financially helpless, David explained. Instead, he's given you every moral and legal justification to destroy him financially while protecting resources he can't touch. It's almost poetic in its irony. As I drove home from David's office that Wednesday afternoon, I felt a familiar energy returning, the strategic excitement that had once driven my most successful deals at Goldman Sachs. Michael had created the perfect conditions for his own destruction while providing me with motivation and resources to execute a response he could never have anticipated. That evening, Michael arrived home with flowers and takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, continuing his performance as the devoted husband caring for his recovering wife. He asked about my day, expressed concern about my energy levels, and suggested we watch a movie together to help me relax. I accepted his offerings graciously while mentally reviewing the timeline David and I had established for the coming weeks. Michael had no idea that his concerned wife had spent the day with one of the state's most formidable divorce attorneys, planning a legal strategy that would expose every aspect of his deception while protecting assets he didn't even know existed. The most satisfying part was how completely Michael had miscalculated every aspect of the situation. He thought he was married to a financially dependent woman who had given up her career and lost her edge. Instead, he was married to an international investment expert who had been building sophisticated financial structures while he assumed she was decoratively managing their household. He thought he could steal shared assets during her medical vulnerability and leave her helpless to respond. Instead, he had provided perfect motivation to someone with resources he couldn't access and legal standing to destroy him both civilly and criminally. He thought he was executing a clever exit strategy that would leave him financially secure while discarding an inconvenient wife. Instead, he was about to discover that the woman he had underestimated possessed every tool necessary to dismantle his life as systematically as he had betrayed hers. As we sat on our couch that evening, Michael's arm around my shoulders while we watched a romantic comedy he had chosen, I felt a calm certainty settling over me. The hurt and shock of discovering his betrayal were giving way to something more powerful. The focused determination of someone who had finally found worthy application for skills that had been dormant too long. Michael had spent months planning to abandon our marriage and steal our shared assets. Now, I would spend the coming weeks demonstrating exactly what he had lost when he chose betrayal over partnership. The woman he thought he could discard was about to become the architect of his complete destruction, and unlike him, I had the resources and expertise to execute my plan flawlessly. The recovery period he thought was making me vulnerable was actually providing perfect cover for me to prepare a response that would exceed his worst nightmares. While he believed his concerned husband performance was maintaining his deception, I was using the time to build a legal and financial strategy that would leave him with nothing while protecting everything that mattered to me. Michael had made the classic mistake of underestimating his opponent while overestimating his own cleverness. In the coming weeks, he would learn exactly how catastrophic that miscalculation had been. The woman he thought he had left helpless in a grocery store checkout line was about to demonstrate the difference between someone who steals from joint accounts and someone who commands millions in international markets. His betrayal had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for my liberation. Now I would use every resource at my disposal to ensure he understood exactly what that liberation would cost him. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October in Colorado. I woke before sunrise, my mind immediately sharp and focused despite the lingering physical effects of surgery. Today was the day I would confront Michael with evidence of his betrayal, but more importantly, today was when he would discover exactly what kind of woman he had chosen to deceive. Michael was already in the shower when I got up, humming an old Eagles song that had been playing on the radio during one of our early dates. The casual contentment in his voice was almost surreal, given what I now knew about his activities over the past week. He had perfected the art of compartmentalization, maintaining his loving husband performance while systematically dismantling our financial life. I made coffee and sat at our kitchen island, reviewing the timeline Chen and I had established. The divorce papers would be filed at 9 o'clock this morning. Marcus Rivera, the private investigator, would simultaneously begin serving subpoenas for Michael's business records and personal communications. By 10 o'clock, Michael's world would begin collapsing in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But first, I wanted to give him one opportunity to be honest, not because I hoped for redemption or reconciliation, but because his response would inform my strategy for the complete destruction I was about to unleash. Some part of me needed to see whether any trace remained of the man I had once loved, or if that person had been as much of an illusion as everything else about our marriage. Michael emerged from the bathroom dressed in his favorite navy suit, the one he wore for important business meetings. His hair was perfectly styled, his cologne subtle but expensive, his smile bright as he kissed my forehead and asked how I was feeling. Even knowing what I knew, his performance was convincing enough to create momentary cognitive dissonance. "Much better," I replied, returning his smile. "Strong enough for a serious conversation, actually." Something flickered across his expression, too brief to interpret clearly. "Oh, what kind of serious conversation?" "About our finances, about what happened with the bank cards on Monday, about some transfers I noticed when I reviewed our statements yesterday." I kept my tone neutral, curious rather than accusatory, giving him space to choose honesty over continued deception. Michael poured himself coffee, his movements slightly more deliberate than usual. "Right. I meant to update you on that. It was exactly what I thought. Some automated security measures triggered by business transfers. Everything should be back to normal now." The lie came so easily that I almost admired his commitment to the performance. He had just claimed that accounts he had completely emptied would be back to normal, as if money could magically reappear through banking algorithms. "That's interesting," I said, pulling out my phone and opening the banking app. "Because I checked this morning, and our joint checking account shows a balance of $23. Our savings account shows zero. Over $200,000 in shared assets. Gone." I watched his face carefully as I spoke. The mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something calculating and cold beneath the surface before snapping back into place. When he smiled, it looked like a grimace. "Sarah, honey, you know how confusing these banking apps can be, especially when you're still recovering from surgery. Let me call them this morning and get it all sorted out. You shouldn't be worrying about this stuff right now." The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Even caught in an undeniable lie, he was attempting to gaslight me by suggesting my legitimate concerns were confusion caused by medical recovery. This was the man I had trusted with every aspect of my life, speaking to me like I was a confused child who couldn't understand basic financial information. "Michael," I said quietly, "I know you took the money. All of it. During the 3 days I was having surgery and recovering in the hospital, you systematically emptied every account we shared. I have the transaction records. I know exactly when each transfer occurred and exactly how much you stole." The word "stole" hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Michael's smile finally disappeared completely, replaced by an expression I had never seen before. Not guilt or shame or even anger, but calculation. He was assessing the situation, determining his next move, evaluating how much I actually knew and what his options might be. "That's a very serious accusation, Sarah." His voice was different now, colder and more controlled. "I hope you're not making decisions based on misunderstanding banking procedures while you're still on pain medication." "I'm completely clear-headed, Michael. Clearer than I've been in years, actually." I stood up from the kitchen island, moving to the dining room where I had organized the documentation I planned to show him. "Let me show you exactly what you did, step by step." Michael followed me reluctantly, his confident businessman demeanor beginning to crack around the edges. I had spread bank statements, transaction records, and timeline documentation across our dining room table like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Tuesday morning at 9:15, while I was being prepped for surgery, you transferred $47,000 from our joint checking account to an account at Colorado Mountain Bank. I pointed to the relevant statement, noting how his eyes tracked my finger to the specific transaction. Tuesday afternoon at 2:30, while I was unconscious in the operating room, you transferred the remaining savings account balance, $156,000, to the same external account. Michael's face had gone pale, but he remained silent as I continued documenting his betrayal. Wednesday morning, you transferred what was left in checking, about $9,000, completing the theft of our shared assets while I was recovering from anesthesia. I looked up from the statements to meet his eyes. You literally robbed your unconscious wife while she was having surgery. I'm trying to understand what kind of person does something like that. For a long moment, Michael said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth or affection I had associated with our marriage for 7 years. Those assets were as much mine as yours, Sarah. I built my business, I earned that money, and I have every legal right to manage our joint accounts as I see fit. The defensive anger in his tone confirmed what I had suspected. He felt entitled to his theft, justified in his betrayal. Our joint accounts, Michael. Joint. Meaning we were supposed to make decisions together about significant financial transactions. Meaning you don't get to unilaterally steal everything while I'm having medical procedures. I kept my voice level despite the fury building inside me. But I'm curious about something else. This wasn't impulsive, was it? You've been planning this for months. His silence was answer enough, but I continued anyway. The business loan payments that weren't actually loan payments. The equipment financing that never happened. The office lease that doesn't exist. You've been systematically stealing from our marriage for over a year, haven't you? Each accusation landed like a physical blow, his expression growing more defensive and angry. I was protecting my business interests, he said finally, diversifying assets in case your career instability created problems down the line. You left Goldman Sachs without consulting me, abandoned a stable income to chase some fantasy about starting your own firm that never materialized. I had to take steps to protect what we built together. The revision of history was staggering. In its dishonesty, my career instability and fantasy about independence. My decision to leave Goldman Sachs had been discussed extensively, and he had been enthusiastic about the flexibility it would provide for both of us. My failure to launch Meridian Advisory had been directly caused by his constant demands for support with his business. But more importantly, his justification revealed the depth of his deception. He had been planning to abandon our marriage while systematically extracting assets for over a year. My surgery had simply provided convenient cover for accelerating his timeline. Michael, I said, my voice now carrying the steel that had once made me formidable in Goldman Sachs negotiations. Let me explain what's going to happen next. At 9 o'clock this morning, divorce papers will be filed. At 9:30, subpoenas will be served for all your business records and personal communications. By 10 o'clock, forensic accountants will begin tracing every dollar you've stolen and every asset you've hidden. His eyes widened as he processed the implications of what I was saying. You can't be serious. Sarah, we can work this out. Marriage counseling, financial planning, whatever you need. But divorce? That's extreme. Extreme? I almost laughed at his characterization. You systematically robbed your wife while she was having surgery, and you think divorce is extreme? Michael, this isn't a marriage problem. This is criminal behavior. Criminal behavior? Now he looked genuinely alarmed. Sarah, you're overreacting. These are civil matters. Family disputes about asset allocation. Nobody goes to jail over divorce proceedings. People absolutely go to jail for theft, fraud, and embezzlement, which is exactly what you've done. I pulled out another folder. From my documentation, this one containing the research Marcus Rivera had already completed. Did you really think I wouldn't discover the shell companies you created? The fake business expenses you've been claiming? The way you've been hiding assets in preparation for leaving our marriage? Michael's composure finally cracked completely. The confident businessman facade disappeared, replaced by panic and rage in equal measure. "You can't do this to me, Sarah. I built my company from nothing. I worked 18-hour days while you played house. I earned every dollar, and I won't let you destroy what I've built because you're hurt about our marriage ending." There it was, finally. The complete absence of remorse, the entitlement, the willingness to rewrite our entire relationship to justify his betrayal. The man I had loved for 9 years, supported for 7, and trusted with my future, had just revealed himself to be a stranger, capable of breathtaking selfishness and cruelty. "Michael," I said, standing up from the dining room table, "you have no idea what you've done. You think you stole money from a financially dependent housewife who gave up her career and lost her edge. You have no idea who you actually married or what you've just motivated me to do." Something in my tone must have penetrated his panic, because his expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. For the first time since I had confronted him, he looked like he was actually listening. "What do you mean?" he asked warily. I smiled, feeling the familiar surge of strategic confidence that had once made me Goldman Sachs's most successful emerging market specialist. "I mean, Michael, that while you were assuming I was decoratively managing our household for 3 years, I was actually building an international investment portfolio worth over $3 million. Money you can't access, can't trace, and can't touch." The color drained from his face as he processed this information. "That's impossible. I know all our accounts. I know our financial situation completely. You know our domestic accounts, our shared investments, our joint financial life. You know nothing about my private banking relationships in Switzerland, my real estate investments in London and Dubai, my currency trading through Singapore, or my venture capital partnerships in Hong Kong." Each revelation hit him like a physical blow, his confident worldview collapsing in real time. "Sarah, how is that even possible? When? How? When you thought I was taking a break from finance to support your career, I was actually expanding my expertise into international markets. When you assumed I had lost my edge by stepping back from Goldman Sachs, I was building relationships with private banks and investment firms throughout Asia and Europe. When you believed I was financially dependent on you, I was creating a portfolio that makes our shared accounts look like pocket change." Michael sank into one of our dining room chairs, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. $3 million? You're saying you have $3 million I don't know about? I'm saying I have resources you couldn't access or steal even if you knew about them. I'm saying that while you were planning to leave me financially helpless, you were actually married to someone with more liquid assets than your entire business is worth. I let that information settle before continuing. I'm also saying that every dollar you stole from our joint accounts is documented, traceable, and recoverable through civil and criminal proceedings. Criminal proceedings, he repeated weakly. "Sarah, please. I understand you're angry, but we can resolve this privately. I'll return the money. We can negotiate a fair divorce settlement. There's no need to involve law enforcement." The pleading in his voice was almost pathetic after years of his condescension and control. But I felt no sympathy for his panic. He had made calculated decisions to betray our marriage and steal our shared assets while I was medically vulnerable. The consequences he was now facing were entirely of his own creation. "Michael, you had 7 years to treat me as an equal partner. You had every opportunity to respect my capabilities and value my contributions. Instead, you systematically dismissed my expertise, minimized my potential, and ultimately chose to rob me while I was unconscious and helpless." I gathered the documentation from the dining room table, organizing it back into folders with practiced efficiency. "Now you get to discover exactly what it costs to underestimate someone with the resources and motivation to destroy you completely." "Destroy me?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, I know I made mistakes, but we loved each other once. We built a life together. You can't seriously be planning to destroy my business, my reputation, everything I've worked for." "Actually, Michael, I can, and I will. Because the life we built together was based on lies, and the love I thought we shared was apparently one-sided. You made the decision to steal from our marriage, and now you get to experience the consequences of that choice." I walked toward the kitchen, leaving him sitting alone with the wreckage of his assumptions. At the kitchen counter, I checked my phone for the time. 8:45. In 15 minutes, David Chen would file divorce papers that would begin the legal process of taking apart Michael's life piece by piece. The private investigator would start serving subpoenas that would expose every aspect of his financial deception. The forensic accountants would begin tracing assets that would ultimately result in criminal charges. Michael followed me into the kitchen, his earlier confidence replaced by desperation. "Sarah, please, let's be reasonable about this. I'll give back every dollar I took. We can split our shared assets fairly. I'll sign whatever agreement you want for the divorce. Just don't destroy my business. Don't file criminal charges, please." I turned to face him, noting how different he looked when stripped of his arrogant confidence. Smaller somehow, less imposing, more like the frightened man he apparently was beneath his successful businessman facade. "Michael, you spent months planning to abandon our marriage while stealing our shared assets. You conducted this betrayal while I was having surgery, when I was most vulnerable and dependent on your support. You showed no mercy, no consideration, and no respect for the woman who had supported your success for 7 years." I paused, letting the weight of his actions settle between us. "Why exactly do you think you deserve mercy now?" "Because we're married," he said, grasping for any argument that might reach me. "Because despite everything, we meant something to each other once. Because destroying me won't make you feel better or fix what's broken between us. You're wrong about that last part, Michael. Watching you face consequences for your choices is going to feel incredibly satisfying. Not because I'm vindictive, but because justice delayed is justice denied, and you've been getting away with treating me like a fool for far too long." My phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Filings complete, subpoenas in process, PI, en route to business location. Call when ready for next phase." I showed Michael the message, watching his face as he read it. "It's done, Michael. The legal proceedings have begun. Your business assets will be frozen pending investigation. Your financial records will be examined by forensic specialists. Your communications will be reviewed for evidence of fraud and embezzlement." "My business," he said weakly. "Sarah, my employees, my contracts, my reputation. You're destroying innocent people along with me." "I'm not destroying anything, Michael. I'm exposing what you destroyed when you decided to steal from your wife during her medical emergency. Your employees will find other jobs. Your contracts will be fulfilled by more ethical companies. Your reputation will reflect your actual character, rather than the facade you've maintained." Michael slumped against the kitchen counter, the full scope of his situation finally becoming clear to him. "How did this happen? How did you know what to do? How did you organize all this so quickly?" "I knew what to do because I'm exactly the woman you married but never bothered to understand. I organized it quickly because I have the financial resources you tried to steal and the professional relationships you assumed I had lost. I executed it effectively because you gave me perfect motivation and legal justification to use every capability I possess." I picked up my purse and car keys, preparing to leave for my meeting with David Chen to review the first phase of our legal strategy. "You underestimated your opponent, Michael. You assumed that the woman who stepped back from her career to support yours had lost her edge, her resources, and her ability to compete at the highest levels. That was a catastrophic miscalculation." "Where are you going?" he asked, panic. evident in his voice. To meet with my attorney to discuss the next phase of taking apart your life as systematically as you betrayed mine. Unlike you, I don't need to steal from joint accounts or hide assets from my spouse. I have my own resources, my own team, and my own plan for ensuring you face appropriate consequences for your choices. As I reached the garage door, Michael called after me one last time. "Sarah, please, I'm begging you. Don't do this. I'll do anything you want. I'll give you everything I have. Just don't destroy me." I turned back to look at him one final time, memorizing the image of the man who had betrayed me now begging for mercy he had never shown. "Michael, you already gave me everything I need. You gave me perfect justification for demonstrating exactly what happens when someone underestimates a woman with the resources and motivation to fight back. You gave me the moral authority to use every advantage I possess without guilt or restraint. You gave me the opportunity to reclaim my professional identity while protecting assets you can't touch. Most importantly, you gave me the chance to show you exactly what you lost when you chose theft over partnership." I opened the garage door and got into my car, leaving Michael standing in our kitchen surrounded by the wreckage of his assumptions and the beginning of consequences he had never imagined possible. As I drove toward David Chen's office, I felt a profound sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing from my life for years. The woman Michael thought he had married was indeed gone, discarded along with the illusion of our partnership. But the woman driving through downtown Denver toward a strategy meeting with one of the state's most formidable attorneys was someone he had never bothered to understand. A financial expert with international resources, sophisticated legal support, and perfect motivation to demonstrate exactly what it cost to betray someone of her capabilities. Michael had spent months planning to leave me financially helpless and emotionally devastated. Instead, he had created the perfect conditions for his own destruction while providing me with every tool necessary to execute it flawlessly. The reckoning he was about to face would exceed his worst nightmares, delivered by the woman he had, dismissed as a decorative appendage to his success. The most beautiful part was that everything I was about to do to him was completely legal, thoroughly documented, and morally justified. Unlike his theft and deception, my response would be conducted through proper channels with appropriate oversight and legitimate authority. Michael had taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between someone who steals from joint accounts while his wife is unconscious and someone who commands millions in international markets while building ironclad legal strategies. He was about to learn that lesson himself, whether he wanted to or not. David Chen's conference room buzzed with controlled energy as I arrived for our 10 o'clock strategy session. The legal machinery I had set in motion was already producing results faster than I had anticipated. David's assistant handed me a steaming cup of coffee and a folder marked "Immediate Developments" as I took my seat at the polished mahogany table. "Sarah," David said, looking up from his laptop with an expression of professional satisfaction mixed with genuine surprise. "Your husband has been busier than we initially thought. Marcus Rivera's preliminary investigation has uncovered some fascinating developments. Marcus himself was present via video conference from what appeared to be a parking garage, his tablet camera showing him sitting in a nondescript sedan with surveillance equipment visible in the background. As a former FBI financial crimes investigator turned private detective, Marcus had developed a reputation for uncovering hidden assets and fraudulent activities that other investigators missed. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus began, his voice clear despite the remote connection, "I've completed the initial sweep of your husband's recent financial activities, and there are several developments you need to know about immediately." I opened the folder David's assistant had provided, scanning the preliminary findings while Marcus explained his discoveries. What I read made my earlier anger seem quaint by comparison. Michael's betrayal went far deeper and was far more elaborate than even my thorough investigation had revealed. "First," Marcus continued, The Colorado Mountain Bank account where your husband transferred the stolen funds has already been emptied. The money was moved yesterday to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, suggesting he was planning to make those assets completely inaccessible to domestic recovery efforts. Yesterday? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He was moving money to offshore accounts while I was confronting him about the theft. It appears the transfer was initiated Wednesday evening and completed Thursday morning, Marcus, I confirmed. Your husband has been working with a financial consultant who specializes in asset protection for high-net-worth divorces, someone who understands how to hide money from forensic accountants and court orders. David leaned forward, his expression grim. Sarah, this elevates the situation significantly. Moving marital assets offshore to avoid recovery in divorce proceedings is a serious felony. We're no longer talking about simple theft. This is sophisticated financial fraud with international implications. The revelation that Michael had been working with professional asset-hiding specialists suggested a level of premeditation that was staggering. This wasn't an impulsive decision to steal money during my medical emergency. This was a carefully orchestrated plan to systematically loot our marriage while making the stolen assets completely unreachable through legal proceedings. There's more, Marcus continued, his tone growing more serious. Your husband's business, Mitchell Properties, has been artificially inflated through fraudulent contract valuations and phantom assets. The company he's been portraying as worth several $1 million appears to have actual assets of less than $400,000, most of which are encumbered by liens and undisclosed debts. I felt a cold realization settling over me as I processed this information. Michael hadn't just stolen from our marriage. He had been presenting a completely fabricated picture of his business success, using false valuations and phantom assets to secure loans and investments that were based on fictional financial strength. The $47 million development project he supposedly secured, I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Doesn't exist, Marcus confirmed. The contracts he's been showing investors and lenders are sophisticated forgeries. The supposed client company appears to be a shell corporation with no actual business operations or assets. Your husband has been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme disguised as a legitimate real estate development business. David was taking notes rapidly, his lawyer's mind immediately recognizing the implications of these discoveries. Sarah, this means Michael's theft from your marriage was probably driven by desperate attempts to prop up his failing fraud scheme. The money he stole wasn't going toward a new life with another woman. It was going toward preventing the collapse of his criminal enterprise. The scope of Michael's deception was breathtaking. Not only had he betrayed our marriage and stolen our shared assets, but our entire lifestyle over the past 2 years had been funded by investor fraud. The expensive restaurant dinners, the luxury vacations, the designer clothing and high-end electronics he had been purchasing. All of it had been paid for with money stolen from people who thought they were investing in legitimate business opportunities. How many victims are we talking about? I asked, my voice barely steady. At least 17 individual investors who put money into fake development projects, Marcus replied. Total losses appear to exceed $3.8 million, though we're still tracing the full extent of the scheme. Your husband has been operating this fraud for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Jesus, I whispered, the magnitude of Michael's criminal activities overwhelming my ability to process them rationally. I've been living with a complete stranger. Everything about our life together was built on lies. David reached across the table and touched my arm gently, his expression compassionate despite the professional context. Sarah, I need you to understand something important. This discovery actually strengthens your position significantly. Michael's criminal activities provide additional legal justification for aggressive asset recovery and civil damages. More importantly, it demonstrates a pattern of fraud that will make his theft from your marriage look like part of a broader criminal enterprise. I appreciated David's attempt to find strategic advantage in these horrifying revelations, but I was struggling to process the emotional implications of what I had learned. The man I had been married to for 7 years, the person I had trusted with my financial security and emotional well-being, was apparently a career criminal who had been defrauding investors while stealing from our marriage. There's one more development you need to know about, Marcus continued, his tone suggesting he had saved the most significant revelation for last. Your husband appears to be planning to flee the country. I've been monitoring his communications since yesterday, and he's been researching flights to non-extradition countries and making inquiries about establishing residence in nations that don't have cooperative agreements with the United States for financial crimes. He's planning to run? I asked, though the question answered itself. Of course Michael was planning to run. He had stolen money from our marriage, defrauded multiple investors, hidden assets in offshore accounts, and was facing both civil and criminal consequences that could result in decades in prison. The communications suggest he's planning to leave within the next 72 hours, Marcus confirmed. He's been liquidating remaining business assets, converting everything possible to cash, and making arrangements for immediate departure. David's expression had shifted from professional concern to urgent alarm. Sarah, we need to move immediately to prevent flight. I'm going to request an emergency court order to freeze all of Michael's assets and surrender his passport. We can't allow him to escape the country with stolen money and evidence of his criminal activities. The speed with which the situation was escalating felt surreal. 24 hours ago, I had been focused on confronting Michael about stealing from our joint accounts. Now I was learning that he was a career criminal who had defrauded millions of dollars from innocent investors while planning to flee the country to avoid prosecution. What about the other victims? I asked, my thoughts turning to the people who had trusted Michael with their money and their financial futures. The investors he defrauded don't even know yet that their money is gone, do they? Most of them believe their investments are performing normally, Marcus confirmed. Your husband has been sending them fabricated progress reports and fake financial statements suggesting their projects are on schedule and profitable. The collapse of his scheme will devastate some of these families financially. I felt a wave of nausea as I considered the broader implications of Michael's criminal activities. Elderly couples who had invested their retirement savings in his fake development projects. Young families who had trusted him with money intended for their children's education. Small business owners who had believed they were participating in legitimate real estate opportunities. All of them would soon discover that their money was gone, stolen by the man I had been sharing a bed with for 7 years. The man who had kissed my forehead and promised to take care of me while I recovered from surgery. The man who had apparently been capable of looking into the eyes of innocent people and stealing their life savings without a moment's hesitation. David, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. I want to do everything possible to help recover money for the other victims. Whatever it takes, whatever resources I need to provide, I want to ensure that the people Michael defrauded have the best possible chance of getting their money back. David nodded approvingly. That's not only morally admirable, Sarah, but strategically smart. Cooperating fully with law enforcement and victim recovery efforts will demonstrate your complete separation from Michael's criminal activities. It will also provide you with standing to pursue additional civil remedies against him. I'm also prepared to use my international resources to help trace the offshore accounts, I continued, my mind already working through the possibilities. I have relationships with private banks and forensic specialists throughout Europe and Asia who might be able to track Michael's hidden assets more effectively than domestic investigators. Marcus leaned forward in his video conference window, his interest clearly piqued. Mrs. Patterson, that kind of international cooperation could be invaluable. Traditional law enforcement channels for tracing offshore assets can take months or years. Private banking relationships and international financial networks operate much more quickly. Over the next hour, We developed a comprehensive strategy that would leverage every resource at our disposal to prevent Michael's escape while maximizing recovery for all victims of his crimes. David would file emergency motions to freeze assets and restrict travel. Marcus would coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies to initiate criminal investigations. I would activate my international financial network to help trace offshore accounts and hidden assets. The plan was ambitious, complex, and would require precise timing to execute effectively. But as I reviewed the details, I felt the familiar surge of strategic confidence that had once made me successful at Goldman Sachs. This was exactly the kind of challenge I was uniquely qualified to handle, combining legal expertise, financial sophistication, and international resources in ways that would give us advantages Michael couldn't anticipate or counter. "One more thing," David said as we prepared to conclude our strategy session. "Sarah, you should know that Michael's attorney contacted my office this morning. They're requesting an immediate meeting to discuss mutually beneficial resolution options for your divorce proceedings." "His attorney?" I asked. "He hired representation that quickly?" "Apparently he had divorce counsel on retainer already," David replied with a slight smile. "James Morrison from Morrison, Blake & Associates. They specialize in high-asset divorces and have a reputation for aggressive tactics designed to minimize client losses." The fact that Michael had retained divorce counsel before I even knew about his theft confirmed what I had already suspected. His betrayal had been planned for months, possibly longer. He had been preparing for the end of our marriage while I had been supporting his supposedly struggling business and caring for him during what I thought were temporary difficulties. "What kind of mutually beneficial resolution do you think?" "They're planning to propose?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Probably something involving Michael returning a portion of the stolen money in exchange for your agreement not to pursue criminal charges," David speculated. "They'll argue that a negotiated settlement is preferable to protracted litigation that could destroy his business and reputation." "They don't know about the investment fraud yet, do they?" I asked. "No," Marcus confirmed from his video connection. "The criminal investigation is still in preliminary stages. Michael's attorney is probably operating under the assumption that we're dealing with a straightforward marital asset dispute, rather than a federal criminal case involving multiple victims." I considered this information carefully, recognizing the strategic opportunity it represented. Michael and his attorney were preparing for a conventional high-asset divorce negotiation, unaware that they were actually facing criminal prosecution for investment fraud, money laundering, and sophisticated financial crimes. "I think we should take the meeting," I said finally. "Not because I'm interested in negotiating, but because it will give us an opportunity to observe their strategy and confirm what they do and don't know about the broader criminal investigation." David nodded agreement. "It will also give us a chance to deliver some unpleasant surprises when we reveal the scope of what we've discovered. Sometimes the most effective negotiation tactic is demonstrating that your opponent has fundamentally miscalculated their position." As our meeting concluded and I prepared to leave David's office, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that was difficult to process. Anger at the depth of Michael's betrayal and the extent of his criminal activities. Sadness at the realization that my marriage had been built on systematic deception. Determination to ensure that he faced appropriate consequences for his choices. And underneath it all, a growing sense of empowerment as I recognized how thoroughly equipped I was to handle this crisis. Michael had assumed that I would be helpless when he abandoned our marriage and stole our shared assets. Instead, he had provided me with perfect motivation to use capabilities he had never bothered to understand. The woman he thought he was discarding was actually someone with international financial resources, sophisticated legal support, and professional relationships that would prove devastating to his criminal enterprise. More importantly, his betrayal had liberated me from any remaining emotional attachment to our marriage or concern for his welfare. I no longer had to balance my own interests against loyalty to someone who had proven himself capable of breathtaking selfishness and cruelty. I could pursue his complete destruction with clear conscience and unlimited resources. As I drove home, from David's office, my phone rang with a call from Jennifer Walsh, my former Goldman Sachs colleague who now ran her own investment firm in Manhattan. I had contacted Jennifer the previous week about consulting opportunities, but hadn't mentioned the personal crisis that was motivating my return to active practice. "Sarah," Jennifer's voice carried excitement and urgency, "I'm so glad you called yesterday. I have 3 clients who need exactly your expertise, and I mean they need it immediately. Can you start next week?" "Actually, Jennifer, my schedule just became completely flexible. What kind of time frame are we talking about?" I asked, pleased to have professional opportunities developing just as my personal life was imploding. One client is a tech entrepreneur who just received a 9-figure acquisition offer and needs sophisticated international tax planning. Another is a family office looking for alternative investment strategies that can hedge against domestic market volatility. The third is a private equity firm that wants to expand into Asian markets and needs someone who understands regulatory requirements and currency risks. Each opportunity represented exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes work that had made my career rewarding before I had set it aside to support Michael's ambitions. More importantly, the compensation Jennifer outlined would provide complete financial independence while I pursued legal proceedings against Michael. "Jennifer, that sounds perfect. Can you send me the details and I'll review everything this afternoon?" I said, already anticipating the intellectual challenge of returning to sophisticated financial work. "Absolutely. Sarah, I have to ask, what changed? When we talked 6 months ago, you seemed committed to supporting your husband's business and weren't interested in returning to active practice." I paused, considering how much to reveal about my current situation. Let's just say that my domestic priorities have changed dramatically. I'm ready to reclaim my professional identity and put my expertise to work for clients who value what I bring to the table. "That's music to my ears," Jennifer replied. "I'll send over the client profiles and compensation packages. Welcome back to the big leagues, Sarah." As I ended the call, I realized that Michael's betrayal was creating opportunities I hadn't anticipated. Not only was I financially positioned to weather his theft and pursue comprehensive legal remedies, but his actions had eliminated the domestic responsibilities that had prevented me from pursuing ambitious professional opportunities. The irony was almost poetic. Michael had stolen from our marriage to fund his criminal enterprise while planning to abandon me for what he assumed would be a financially advantageous relationship. Instead, he had liberated me to return to a career that would provide far more financial security and professional satisfaction than our marriage had ever offered. By the time I arrived home, I felt energized and focused in ways I hadn't experienced in years. The woman Michael thought he was discarding was actually someone who was uniquely positioned to destroy his criminal enterprise while building something far more valuable from the wreckage of their marriage. The house felt different when I walked through the garage door. Not because anything had changed physically, but because my relationship to the space had been fundamentally altered. This was no longer the home I shared with someone I loved and trusted. This was the residence of a criminal who had stolen from me while I was medically vulnerable, a person who had been systematically defrauding innocent people while pretending to be a legitimate businessman. Michael's car wasn't in the garage, which meant he was presumably out conducting whatever remaining business his criminal enterprise required. I used his absence to conduct my own investigation of our home, looking for evidence of his criminal activities and planning that I might have missed during my initial discovery process. In his home office, I found documents that confirmed Marcus Rivera's investigation, fake contracts for non-existent development projects, forged financial statements showing fictional business performance, investment agreements signed by people who had trusted Michael with their life savings, people who had no idea their money had been stolen and hidden in offshore accounts. I photographed everything, uploading the images to the same encrypted cloud storage I used for my international investment records. This evidence would be crucial for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts. More importantly, it provided additional confirmation that Michael's theft from our marriage was part of a broader pattern of criminal behavior that had been ongoing for years. As I reviewed the documents, I was struck by the sophistication of Michael's fraud scheme. These weren't amateurish forgeries or simple confidence tricks. These were professionally crafted documents designed to deceive experienced investors and financial professionals. Michael had clearly been working with criminal associates who specialized in investment fraud and money laundering. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Michael. I need to talk to you immediately. It's urgent." I stared at the message for a long moment, considering my options. Part of me wanted to ignore him completely, to let him face the consequences of his choices without any input from me. But another part of me was curious about what he thought was urgent enough to risk contacting me when he knew I was actively pursuing legal action against him. I typed a brief response. "You can communicate through your attorney. I have nothing to say to you directly." His reply came immediately. "Please, Sarah. I'm trying to make things right. I can fix this if you'll just talk to me for 5 minutes." The audacity was breathtaking. After years of systematic deception, theft of our shared assets during my medical emergency and criminal fraud involving millions of dollars, he thought he could fix this with a 5-minute conversation. The request revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood both the scope of what he had done and my response to his betrayal. I didn't reply to his second message. Instead, I forwarded both texts to David Chen with a note explaining that Michael was attempting to contact me directly despite ongoing legal proceedings. David's response was immediate. "Do not engage. Forward any additional communication attempts. His attorney just requested emergency meeting for Monday morning." The weekend passed in a blur of activity as I coordinated between legal counsel, financial advisors, and law enforcement agencies. Marcus Rivera's investigation had attracted the attention of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who were now actively investigating Michael's investment fraud scheme. David Chen was preparing comprehensive civil litigation that would seek recovery of all stolen assets plus substantial damages and penalties. Most importantly, I was reactivating professional relationships and accepting consulting assignments that would provide both intellectual challenge and financial compensation, far exceeding what I had given up to support Michael's supposedly legitimate business. By Sunday evening, I had established a comprehensive support structure that would enable me to pursue Michael's complete destruction while protecting my own interests and building something far more valuable from the foundation his betrayal had inadvertently created. The woman he had tried to discard was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when someone with her capabilities, resources, and motivation decided that her soon-to-be ex-husband needed to face appropriate consequences for his choices. Michael had underestimated his opponent catastrophically, and he was about to learn exactly what that miscalculation would cost him. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only comes after a storm has passed and the landscape has been permanently altered. I stood in my new downtown Denver office, a corner suite in a glass tower that housed some of the city's most prestigious financial firms, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and amber. The view was spectacular, but, more importantly, it was mine. Earned through my own expertise and secured with resources Michael had never known existed. 3 months had passed since that Friday morning when I confronted Michael with evidence of his betrayal. 3 months that had transformed my life so completely that the woman who had once worried about declined credit cards in a grocery store checkout line felt like a stranger from someone else's memory. The emergency meeting David Chen had arranged with Michael's attorney had taken place as scheduled, but not at all as Michael's legal team had anticipated. Instead of negotiating a quiet divorce settlement to avoid embarrassing publicity, they had walked into a conference room where federal prosecutors were waiting with indictments for investment fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. Michael's face when he realized the true scope of what was happening had been worth every moment of pain his betrayal had caused. The confident businessman who had stolen from our marriage while I was unconscious had transformed into a panicked criminal begging for mercy he had never shown his victims. His attorney, James Morrison, had attempted to maintain professional composure while his client's world collapsed in real time. But even Morrison's reputation for aggressive divorce tactics couldn't protect against the reality that Michael was facing federal criminal charges that carried potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in prison. The attempted flight to non-extradition countries that Marcus Rivera had uncovered became additional evidence of consciousness of guilt. The offshore accounts Michael had used to hide stolen assets became the foundation for money laundering charges. The sophisticated fraud scheme he had operated through Mitchell Properties became a federal criminal enterprise investigation. Within 48 hours of that emergency meeting, Michael was in federal custody with bail set so high that even his legitimate assets couldn't cover it. The man who had planned to abandon our marriage and flee the country with stolen millions was instead sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial for crimes that would likely result in decades of imprisonment. But the most satisfying aspect of Michael's downfall wasn't his personal destruction, though I would be lying if I claimed that didn't provide some emotional satisfaction. The most meaningful outcome was the recovery of assets for the innocent, people he had defrauded. My international banking relationships and forensic financial expertise had proven invaluable in tracing the offshore accounts where Michael had hidden stolen funds. Working closely with federal investigators and victim recovery specialists, we had been able to recover approximately 80% of the money Michael had stolen from his investment fraud victims. The elderly couple from Aurora who had invested their retirement savings in Michael's fake development project received back nearly their entire nest egg. The young family from Highlands Ranch who had trusted him with money for their children's college education recovered enough to secure their kids' educational futures. The small business owner from Lakewood who had believed she was participating in a legitimate real estate opportunity got back the funds she needed to keep her company operating. Watching those families receive their recovered money had been more emotionally rewarding than any professional achievement in my career. These were people who had trusted the man I had been married to, people who had been victimized by someone I had shared a bed with for 7 years. Helping them recover from his betrayal felt like partial redemption for my own failure to recognize his criminal nature. My personal financial recovery had been even more complete. The joint accounts Michael had emptied represented less than 6% of my actual net worth, a minor inconvenience rather than the devastating loss he had intended. The divorce settlement, negotiated while Michael was in federal custody and facing decades in prison, had awarded me everything of value in his legitimate business assets. More importantly, Michael's betrayal had liberated me from the domestic responsibilities and emotional limitations that had constrained my professional development for years. I was no longer someone's wife trying to balance personal ambitions with marital obligations. I was an independent financial professional with complete autonomy to pursue opportunities that aligned with my capabilities and interests. The consulting work Jennifer Walsh had offered had evolved into a partnership arrangement with her Manhattan investment firm. My expertise in international markets and relationships with private banks throughout Asia and Europe had proven invaluable for clients seeking sophisticated investment strategies and global diversification. Within 2 months, I was generating more income than I had ever earned at Goldman Sachs, working with clients whose challenges required exactly the kind of complex analysis and strategic thinking that energized me professionally. Tech entrepreneurs, planning IPOs, and needing international tax optimization. Family offices seeking alternative investments in emerging markets. Private equity firms expanding into regions where regulatory knowledge and cultural understanding were crucial for success. The intellectual stimulation of returning to high-level financial work had been intoxicating after years of channeling my expertise into supporting Michael's supposedly struggling business. Every day brought new challenges that required me to utilize skills I had maintained despite stepping back from active practice. More significantly, I had discovered that my 3 years of international investing during my marriage had generated not just financial returns, but professional credibility that enhanced my consulting value. Clients were impressed not only by my Goldman Sachs background and academic credentials, but by my proven track record of successful independent investing in markets where many American professionals lacked experience. The woman Michael had dismissed as a financially dependent housewife who had lost her professional edge was actually someone who had evolved into a more sophisticated and valuable advisor than she had been during her corporate career. His betrayal had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for me to discover and develop capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. My new office in downtown Denver reflected this professional renaissance. The space was elegant but not ostentatious, designed to convey competence and sophistication rather than flashy wealth. International time zone clocks tracked markets in Hong Kong, Singapore, London, and Zurich. Multiple monitors displayed real-time financial data and currency fluctuations. A secure communication system enabled encrypted conversations with clients and banking partners throughout the world. But the most meaningful element of my office wasn't technological or aesthetic. It was the photograph on my desk of the families who had recovered their money from Michael's fraud scheme. The elderly couple from Aurora, the young family from Highlands Ranch, the small business owner from Lakewood, and 14 other victims whose trust Michael had violated and whose financial security he had threatened. Their recovery had been possible because I possessed resources Michael couldn't access and relationships he couldn't damage. But more importantly, their experience had taught me something profound about the difference between wealth and security, between financial success and personal integrity. Michael had pursued money through deception and theft, treating other people's trust and financial security as resources to be exploited for his personal advantage. His approach had generated temporary profits and lifestyle inflation, but ultimately led to complete destruction when his criminal activities were exposed. My approach had been different from the beginning, focused on creating value through expertise and building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than deception. The international portfolio I had developed hadn't just generated financial returns. It had created a network of professional relationships that enhanced my capabilities and provided access to opportunities unavailable through traditional domestic channels. The consulting business I was building operated on the same principles, providing genuine value to clients through sophisticated analysis and strategic advice, developing long-term relationships based on trust and competence, creating sustainable success through ethical practices rather than short-term exploitation. The contrast between these approaches had never been clearer than during Michael's federal trial, which had concluded just 2 weeks earlier. I had testified as a prosecution witness, explaining how my international financial expertise had enabled investigators to trace his hidden assets and recover stolen funds. Sitting in that federal courtroom, watching Michael's attorney present his desperate defense arguments while prosecutors systematically dismantled his criminal enterprise, I had felt a profound sense of closure. Not because of his conviction and sentencing, though 22 years in federal prison was certainly appropriate justice for his crimes. The closure came from recognizing how completely I had recovered from his betrayal, not just financially, but emotionally and professionally. The woman testifying as an expert witness about international financial investigations was someone Michael had never bothered to understand during our marriage. He had been married to a financial professional with sophisticated capabilities and extensive resources, but had chosen to see only a supportive wife who had stepped back from her career. His failure to recognize my actual value had ultimately enabled both his betrayal and my response to it. If he had understood my financial sophistication and international resources, he might have chosen a different strategy for ending our marriage. If he had appreciated my professional capabilities, he might have sought partnership rather than deception. But Michael's character had made such recognition impossible. He was fundamentally someone who viewed other people as resources to be exploited rather than partners to be valued. His treatment of me during our marriage had been consistent with his treatment of the investment fraud victims. Identify assets that could be extracted, develop strategies for taking control of those assets, execute the extraction while maintaining facades that prevented detection. The difference was that his other victims hadn't possessed the resources and capabilities necessary to respond effectively to his betrayal. They had been genuinely vulnerable to his criminal activities in ways that I had never been, despite his assumption that stealing from our joint accounts would leave me financially helpless. My ability to recover their money and pursue his destruction had been possible only because of advantages he hadn't known existed. The international portfolio he couldn't access, the professional relationships he couldn't damage, the expertise he had never bothered to understand. Those advantages hadn't been created through luck or inheritance. They had been developed through years of disciplined study, strategic thinking, and relationship building that continued even when I wasn't actively practicing. The skills that made me valuable at Goldman Sachs had evolved and expanded during my marriage, becoming more sophisticated rather than atrophying as Michael had assumed. This realization had implications that extended far beyond my personal situation. How many other women were living with partners who systematically undervalued their capabilities and contributions? How many intelligent, educated, professionally accomplished women had allowed domestic responsibilities and marital dynamics to obscure their own potential? My experience suggested that stepping back from active career pursuit didn't necessarily mean losing professional capabilities, especially for someone who maintained intellectual curiosity and continued learning. The 3 years I had spent supporting Michael's business while developing my international portfolio had actually enhanced my value as a financial advisor rather than diminishing it. The key was maintaining professional identity and continuing skill development even when external circumstances limited immediate career applications. The international investing I had pursued as a hobby had become the foundation for consulting expertise that exceeded what I had offered as a Goldman Sachs employee. This perspective had influenced my approach to mentoring young women who were navigating their own career development challenges. I had begun speaking at professional development events and business schools, sharing insights about maintaining financial independence and professional capabilities, even during periods of domestic focus. The message wasn't that women should avoid marriage or domestic responsibilities, but that they should approach those choices strategically rather than allowing them to completely subsume professional identity. Financial independence and skill development could continue through various channels, even when traditional career advancement was temporarily limited. My story resonated particularly strongly with women who had experienced their own versions of professional dismissal or personal betrayal. The specific circumstances were usually different, but the underlying dynamics were often similar. Intelligent, capable women who had allowed others to define their value and limit their potential. The recovery process involved reclaiming professional identity, rebuilding financial independence, and developing support systems that recognized and valued their actual capabilities. For some, this meant returning to previous careers with enhanced perspective and motivation. For others, it meant discovering new professional directions that aligned better with their evolved interests and expertise. In every case, the process required honest assessment of actual resources and capabilities, rather than accepting external definitions of value and potential. Many women possessed more financial sophistication, professional skills, and strategic thinking ability than they realized, but had been conditioned to undervalue those capabilities or channel them into supporting others' ambitions. My international portfolio had been possible only because I had maintained confidence in my analytical abilities and continued developing expertise even when those skills weren't being formally recognized or compensated. If I had accepted Michael's implicit message that my professional value had diminished, I never would have pursued the sophisticated investments that ultimately enabled my response to his betrayal. This afternoon, I had a video conference scheduled with 3 potential clients who represented exactly the kind of challenging, intellectually stimulating work that had initially drawn me to international finance. a biotech startup seeking investment, partners in Asia for revolutionary cancer treatment development, a renewable energy company planning expansion into African markets where regulatory knowledge and cultural understanding were crucial for success, a family office looking for alternative investment strategies that could hedge against domestic economic instability while generating superior returns. Each opportunity required sophisticated analysis, international expertise, and strategic thinking that would utilize my capabilities fully while providing substantial compensation and professional satisfaction. These were the kinds of clients and challenges I had once thought were permanently beyond my reach after stepping back from Goldman Sachs. Michael's betrayal had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for me to discover that my professional potential had actually expanded rather than diminished during our marriage. The woman he had tried to discard was someone far more formidable and valuable than he had ever recognized. As I prepared for the afternoon's client consultations, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed over the past few months. The woman who had once worried about declined credit cards was now managing millions in international investments while building a consulting practice that exceeded her previous career achievements. The personal betrayal that had seemed devastating in October had become the catalyst for professional renaissance that would have been impossible without the motivation and liberation his criminal behavior had provided. Michael had intended to steal from our marriage and abandon me for what he assumed would be a more advantageous situation. Instead, he had given me every resource and justification necessary to build something far more valuable than what he had tried to destroy. The irony was perfect and complete. His theft had targeted joint accounts that represented less than 6% of my actual resources. His deception had eliminated emotional obligations that had constrained my professional development. His betrayal had provided moral authority to pursue his complete destruction without guilt or restraint. Most importantly, his fundamental misunderstanding of my capabilities had ensured that I possessed every advantage necessary to respond effectively to his criminal behavior, while protecting myself and helping his other victims recover from his fraud. The woman he had underestimated had proven to be exactly the wrong person to steal from during surgery, exactly the wrong person to deceive about financial matters, and exactly the wrong person to abandon for what he assumed would be an easy escape from marital responsibilities. Michael would spend the next 22 years in federal prison, contemplating the catastrophic miscalculation that had destroyed his freedom while inadvertently creating the foundation for my complete professional and personal liberation. The Q woman he had dismissed as a decorative appendage to his success had become the architect of his destruction and the designer of her own renaissance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new clients, and new opportunities to apply expertise that had evolved far beyond what Michael had ever bothered to understand. The future I was building was entirely my own creation, funded by resources he couldn't touch and guided by capabilities he had never recognized. Sometimes the most devastating personal betrayals create openings for our greatest professional achievements. Michael had provided me with perfect motivation to demonstrate exactly what was possible when someone with my resources and determination decided to reclaim her power and build something extraordinary from the wreckage of his deception. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out!